Yeah. All right. Well, okay, as far as Iran, back to Iran here real quick, which I guess we're still on Iran, right, only in terms of Russia, but anyway, more on Iran again. Oh, and this includes Russia, too. They're part of the P5+1, the Security Council, the permanent members of the Security Council plus Germany. And apparently, Alan, Bush has backed down a little bit, and they've made an offer toward the Iranians that they could have some talks about having some talks one day, if only the Iranians will quit expanding their uranium enrichment, which is maybe even a full half step back from the demand of unconditional surrender before any talks take place.
I don't know. I did a column a few years ago saying that, reminding people that years ago there were what we called Kremlinologists, which scholars and academics in the West who tried to study the various public signs that could be seen about what was going on behind the scenes in the Kremlin, and would draw very great conclusions out of who was in which order at a reviewing stand of a military parade, etc. And to some extent, we have to study our own government that way because it's so secretive. It's very hard to know what's going on with it.
It really is like that, isn't it? Trying to guess, well, what's Robert Gates' real position versus Dick Cheney? Is he just, a supplicant and he's playing good cop, or is he really trying to thwart Cheney's will here? And where does Condoleezza Rice come down? She sure sounds like a liar on TV. We all just have to guess.
So it really is tough to figure out what our government's intentions are.
Yeah, it really does seem that way. Well, I guess we can be sure that they want to keep killing Africans for the time being. Barack Obama seems to have an entire list of African countries that need our help. And, of course, John McCain has promised to invade the Sudan once he gets power. The war continues, the proxy war, I guess, continues to rage in Somalia. Any hope for the future of that poor continent under American rule?
The best thing about Africa for Africa is that there's not that many resources that the United States and Europe want to go after. Yeah, there's some oil here and there, and the Chinese apparently have some interest in some of the resources. But the less foreign intervention in that continent, the better off they're going to be. Not that they've done all that greatly without foreign intervention either, but some of that's a legacy of colonialism, and some of it's the unrealistic high hopes that people had after colonial rule ended in African countries, and they got kleptocrats instead of foreign kleptocrats. But Africa should be grateful that it isn't seen as strategically significant in the great geopolitical games.
Yeah, great luck on their part, except I guess in the Horn of Africa there, you mentioned oil here and there. One of those places is Somalia.
Yeah.
And we have a proxy war there since December 2006, which, of course, goes unreported in American media, but people die there every day.
The tragic thing about Somalia is the UN and various other international agencies have tried to get a good, proper nation-state put together, on the Western European model. And it didn't work. And, when they were almost completely decentralized and by modern standards didn't have a proper central government, they were actually starting to recover a little bit.
Yeah, the Islamic Courts Union, I don't know anybody who would argue that that's, the best way to rule this society or anything like that, but best I can tell about them, if we disregard the three men, the literally 1, 2, 3 men wanted for questioning the suspects in the Africa embassy bombings, if you take their so-called presence, if they ever even existed, out of the situation, you look at just the Islamic Courts Union, it was basically the uncles and the grandfathers in the neighborhoods got together and made a deal that they would be the decision makers, and they decided on a somewhat decentralized system, but it really did seem to come from the ground up. It seemed like a very natural order kind of thing, and the problem was they had the word Islamic in the name, and I'm sure they weren't, the most open and loving government in the world, but there's not too many of those. And what they did seem to do was at least stop the fighting until we started it again.
And they recognize that in these traditional tribal societies there are tribal customs. They haven't brought shiny new buildings and tremendous economic progress, but they have at least kept a semblance of peace for centuries and centuries. And so you need to respect those kinds of traditions.
Yeah. Instead, we overthrow them.
If you're going to have a functioning society in a country like that, whereas the UN and the West seem to just want to come in and build top down, start a government that's just like every other government, without any particular interest in, respect for, or knowledge about the long traditions of the country.
Mm-hmm. Well, there's 700,000 refugees as of right now living on the road on the way out of Somalia, or on the way out of Mogadishu, I mean to say. And they say tens of thousands of people have been killed, no end in sight. And it's exactly what you say. The UN and the U.S. created a government, a central government over in Ethiopia, and they decided they would come in and install it. And it's been an absolute disaster.
I wonder when, as and if, the notion that diplomats and military people in Washington and London and Paris and Moscow know so much better how other countries should be run and are obliged to intervene because they're so ignorant and backward, how much longer that fantasyland belief can persist. It's been more resilient than I would have expected, I must admit.
Yeah, well, reality is attacking it from all angles, as Gareth Porter wrote about Petraeus' Iran fantasies in Counterpunch last week. Look out, propaganda line. Here comes a bunch of truth, and yet the propaganda line really holds up well against facts, it seems like. No matter what it is.
I don't know. The desire to believe is strong.
You know here's what it's going to take, Alan. Everybody in the libertarian movement is going to have their own TV show. And that's the only way to change it. We've got to take over the TV box.
Okay.
All right, go.
I would go for that.
Yeah, somebody give me a show. I'll show up and do it.
Yeah, I would too.
Although I got to say, this is really the best of all worlds I have going now.
Too, just to get the ratings up.
All right, everybody. That's Alan Bock. He's a senior editorial writer at the Orange County Register, America's libertarian newspaper. And he writes Eye on the Empire for Antiwar.com. He's the author of Ambush at Ruby Ridge. Great book. Pissed me off. And also The Politics of Medical Marijuana. Thanks very much for your time today, Alan.
Oh, thanks so much for thinking about me, Scott, and keep it up.
All right. Thanks, man.
Take care.